2 o'clock, so we'll start the meeting. And thanks for your attendance. Apologies for absence. We've got Barry Brotherton, Daniel Meredith, and Luke Rakes. But we have got substitute member, Councillor Ray Dutton from Rochdale, and as ever, I do really appreciate substitute members coming along to. It's quite interesting how you come from, often come from a different dimension really to these meetings. We're not here all the time, so many thanks. And I've noted here that Kate, you've got to go at 3:30.
Possibly a little bit before though.
Okay, we understand that. The chair's announcements and urgent business, that there aren't any. Are there any declarations of interest? Thank you. Can we go then to the minutes of the last meeting, which were held on the 8th of June? And are there any factual inaccuracies in the minutes? In that case, is it your wish that we approve the minutes? Great. Thank you. And I don't think there's any actions arising from the minutes other than what's on the action list. And I think there are a few items, I think, for distribution from the airport report, which I think are either on their way or will be on the way fairly shortly.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the next we've got then is the local enterprise partnership.
Yeah, we're just waiting for Mike Blackburn to arrive. I don't know whether it might...
has it not arrived yet? No. Oh, right, sorry.
I think it was always going to be...
No, we sorted that out eventually.
Sorry, can I just quickly look out there? Sorry.
Okay. And if he's not there, we'll go on to another item on the agenda. Can we go on to the Brexit impacts in that case? And we've got John Holden here to give us his report.
Thank you, Chair. And sorry, I will. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, great. So this report, which you've seen, gives an update on the monitoring and analysis that the Combined Authority has been doing of the impact of the result of the referendum to leave the European Union and what we know about what the future arrangements might be with the European Union going forward. I'll just go through the report quickly just to give some of the key messages. I'm conscious that it was quite a complex set of documents. It's quite a difficult and complex area to analyse and to succinctly put across the key messages, but I'll try and do that in my remarks now. I'll talk firstly about the work we've been doing on an ongoing basis to monitor the impact of the referendum on the UK's and Greater Manchester's economy, talk a bit about the modelling work that we've been able to do to look at the potential impacts of different trading arrangements with the EU on Greater Manchester's economy, and say with a few words about what the white paper might mean for that. But obviously it's really early days so far. So to start with the Brexit monitor work, so for the past 2 years we've been producing this on a monthly basis, looking at 5 areas, looking at macroeconomic trends, trends for business investment in key sectors, impacts around trade regulation and access to EU funding, impacts on the property market and housing markets, and issues relating to economic inclusion. I think it's fair to say that there's quite a lot of noise in the data and quite a lot of contradictory signals. It's not possible at this stage to easily disaggregate which of those are related to Brexit, which of those are related to other, larger global trends in the global economy. So all this is said with those caveats in mind. In terms of UK macroeconomic trends, we have seen a slowdown in economic growth. The UK GDP grew by 0.1% in Q1 2018. That's the slowest rate since Q4 2012 and was on the back of growth of just 0.4% in Q4 2017. Overall, the UK has gone from having one of the highest forecast rates for growth in the G7 down to being in amongst the lowest. That said, some of the data from business sentiment surveys has showed continued robust economy. The Purchasing Managers Index show figures which indicate the economy is continuing to grow. The Northwest has outperformed the UK on those measures, which I think is down to our exporters benefiting from the weak pound. We've seen strong trade performance in 2017. Again, on the back of the weakening of the pound, some evidence that that's now washed through, so exporters might struggle going forward. In terms of business investment in key sectors, the Growth Company has been monitoring the views of Greater Manchester businesses on a monthly basis since the recession. The main messages from that have been that most businesses aren't planning on changing their investment decisions on the back of a referendum result. 55%, 67% of businesses intend to keep hiring or investing at the same level as compared to a pre-referendum. I think probably the key message that comes out of that work is the level of uncertainty about the impacts. So 37% of firms at the last survey were unsure whether Brexit would have an impact on their hiring decisions. 23% were unsure what that impact might be on their investment decisions. So uncertainty is a big concern there. Particularly worried around potential customs delays, about their ability to be able to attract and retain talent, and also worried about potential divergence in regulations. Those are the consistent messages that come back from those surveys. In terms of other sectors, we've seen a real strengthening in manufacturing, and manufacturing is typically its growth levels has typically lagged behind services on the Purchasing Managers Index. That's flipped around since the referendum results, and manufacturing has been stronger than services. Retail has remained reasonably strong on the back of continued consumer confidence, although some evidence that retail growth now is starting to flatten. The impacts around trade, regulation and access to European Union funding are all heavily associated with or they are bound up in the negotiations which are going on with the EU at the moment. So it's not possible to understand the impact of those fully yet. I think there are concerns which have been consistently flagged in our monitoring report around the potential impact of the loss of EU funding. So EU funding in terms of European Social Fund and European Reconstruction Development Funds has been a huge source of economic development funding for Greater Manchester in recent years. The UK government's guaranteed to match that during the transition period and to develop a new shared prosperity fund to replace it in the longer term, although there's no details yet about how that UK shared prosperity fund will operate and what it will look like. We understand that government are going to be consulting on that imminently. That'll be important for us as Greater Manchester to feed in to make sure that it is structured as we would like it to be. Greater Manchester's universities report significant concerns about the potential loss of European funding for science innovation activity and loss of access into European academic networks and access to their specialist facilities. So there's risks potentially on the horizon there. The property and housing markets have remained strong, and we can't see any noticeable impact of the result on either of those, up or down. Issues around economic inclusion, there are concerns there. Unemployment has started to pick up in recent months. We're now at a 46-month high for unemployment, although that said we are still at historically low levels. Probably more concerning still is the impact of inflation as the weak pound has been fed through into cost of living for residents, and that's been really marked over a period. The Household Finance Index shows that household finances are continuing to worsen, so there's big concerns there on the inclusion side. as part of the report, I shared a report that the Combined Authority published back in March, which brought together the work we've done to model the potential impacts of different forms of trade deals with the European Union on Greater Manchester's economy. I think probably the starting point to say that government have been doing regional analysis, but they haven't yet published that formally. In March 2018, the House of Commons Exiting the European Union Committee released a summary of some analysis which government has undertaken, which we've been able to review. What their analysis suggests is that under all the different scenarios they're looked at, there will be an adverse effect on the UK's economy from leaving the European Union, and that the North West was going to be one of the 4 regions hardest hit under both a soft or a hard Brexit scenario. The government's figures were that impact could be between 2 and 12 points lower than baseline projections, although it did make clear that the impacts very much depend on the outcomes of the negotiations, and that it's likely that places which are more exposed to European Union trade are going to have a greater impact than other places, and Greater Manchester does have a higher proportion of its trade with European Union countries than other places do. In terms of our analysis, we've run some of that government analysis and run it through Greater Manchester's numbers through what we think their model is. What that says is that we think that non-tariff barriers are going to be much more significant potentially than tariff barriers. That's particularly true on services. We haven't been able to model services, but services are very much, there's not huge tariff barriers to services, but there are really significant non-tariff barriers. We've just run the numbers, and if we see a sort of there's potential additional costs for business from being outside of the EU, ranging from around £170 million per year under an EEA type agreement, up to about £300 million per year if there were no deal or we were trading under World Trade Organization rules. So potentially potentially hugely significant there. Tariff barriers, the best figure we could come to there was around £150 million per annum for exporters. That just applies to goods, so we haven't been able to model services because there's no local figures for service exports at Greater Manchester, actually a level below the UK. What we do know is that about 80% of our economy is services, so that's hugely significant for us. There's also significant potential impacts around the labour market and access to skills. This just highlights the sectors which are most reliant on migrant labour from the EU, so particular concentrations in distribution, hotels and restaurants, banking and finance, manufacturing and public services. And the report also notes that there are potential impacts on the movement of capital and in terms of inward investment, although again it hasn't been yet possible to quantify that. And then that just brings me on to conclude then around the white paper analysis, and obviously that was published yesterday, so it's quite a long document which I think many people are reading, and you're probably reading the same newspaper reports that I am. I think just not to comment on the content of the deal, but just what it might mean for Greater Manchester's economy. There has been, I think, some reporting that this is a softening of the Brexit approach, but actually, if you read the detail, we're still what we would have been calling a hard Brexit 2 years ago, in that it's leaving the customs union and single market. We haven't done analysis yet, but UK in a Change in Europe, which is a think tank funded by the government, has done some analysis, and they think that the impact of that deal is likely to be a loss if we got that arrangement. And obviously, it is just the starting point for our negotiation. But if we got that arrangement, it would be something like a negative impact on the economy of about 3% of GDP over a 15-year period. So even if we got that outcome, there are risks ahead to the economy. So I've probably talked for long enough, Chair. So I will hand over to you and the committee to answer questions.
Well, look, just maybe, thanks for that analysis, and obviously let me throw it out for questions to the committee, and I'll come back with a few questions I've got at the end. Questions? Susan.
Thank you. I'll just ask some obvious ones then, John. Thank you. You've given us quite a bit of information in the papers. You've talked about modelling, so I need to ask you about what the GMCA's role then is in building resilience and in, if you like, contingency planning. Can you say anything to those things, which of course are, I suppose, which might well be the modelling, but that's about how we manage the worst type of impact that we might end up suffering, what, across the next 5 years or even longer?
Do you want me to come back? Yeah, I mean, I think the Greater Manchester Combined Authority's role is, so part of it is to understand what those risks are and to be able to ensure that partners who are involved in the direct delivery of services to businesses and residents are aware of those risks and aware of the opportunities as well, and they're factoring those into the business decisions that they are making. I think the Combined Authority also has an important role of ensuring that the Greater Manchester specific issues are understood and are articulated to national government, and you will see in both Andy and Richard and Mike and others have been making the case consistently that the north of England generally and Greater Manchester in particular need to have a greater say in the negotiations and be cited on where those discussions are up to. We've also been pushing government to undertake a detailed regional analysis alongside us and to share that with us, which they have been unwilling to do as of yet. We've shared our analysis with government and we're now part of a working group with a department for exiting the European Union where we're feeding information in. What we're not getting is the information being fed back out to us. I think the other important points for the Combined Authority, I think the messages we've been giving to government are around those labour market issues, particularly around skills and ensuring that we've got the levers to be able to provide our residents with the skills to be able to access the jobs that are coming and ensure that employers are able to access the skills that they need.
Mark, next.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just to be clear, and this isn't intended as a facetious question, but John, you gave a fairly lengthy introduction to the report, and like all members had read it before we started. Is there anything positive that's coming out of this at the moment? Because we keep being told, that there are challenges, but there are opportunities as well. And I just don't see it from your introduction. All I can see are difficulties, challenges, problems, call it what you may. There just didn't seem to be anything positive in your verbal report or indeed in the written report in front of us. Please take the opportunity to tell me I'm wrong if you think we are making progress on any of these issues. Because if we are, that's great, but it's certainly not apparent to me. Thank you.
I feel slightly difficult question to answer. I think if you review the analysis which is coming out from independent research organisations and bodies across the UK, the analysis does suggest that leaving the customs union and single market is going to have a net negative effect on the UK's economy. There are potential upsides in terms of us being able to negotiate trading arrangements with countries which with countries sort of in a more flexible and open way than is currently the case because we're part of the customs union. I think there's real challenges in the practicalities of the UK being able to do that, and I think the white paper starts to illustrate some of the difficult choices that we have in front of us. I think from my perspective, I think the real opportunities opportunities for Greater Manchester is that this period of exiting the European Union is requiring the UK government to look at the economic framework of the whole UK and looking at how it develops national policy and the level to which things are centralised or localised. And I think there is an opportunity for Greater Manchester to make the case that as powers get brought back from the European Union, more of those should be given to city regions so they have the levers to be able to respond to the economic opportunities and the challenges that it faces.
Okay, Mark.
Thank you. Going back to Susan's point regarding the combined authorities' role around resilience and contingency planning, your report states that the city region is going to be badly affected, more or worse affected than the rest of England because of the exports to the EU from GM firms. Are we able to identify specific areas within the conurbation, such as local authorities, who may be affected differently or to a greater or lesser degree, so that resilience and contingency planning can be focused in those areas?
I think the route we've got to do that is through the work that the growth company is doing with specific businesses, and they do engage with hundreds of businesses every week, and are speaking to them about the potential impacts of Brexit and the risks that they're facing. And the combined authority and local authorities have jointly just invested alongside the local enterprise partnership in a new productivity and inclusive growth programme to ensure that there is a business support arrangement in place which is able to provide that support to businesses in the period of transition from the European Union.
Kate?
Just kind of conflating a couple of different things that I've been aware of. Obviously, we've had the news from big businesses talking about, we don't know what's going to happen, we're going to have to make a decision, and there's a certain amount of we can't wait and see for much longer. We've got to start doing things, and big businesses are talking about, moving out of Britain. I also was talking to a very small business that's a t-shirt supplier, printer and supplier, and they were talking about how difficult it is because their suppliers are waiting and seeing, so they can't get hold of products. And I wondered how much of this sort of wait and see is having a damaging effect now because of the unknown. I suppose that's quite vague and it's probably quite hard to answer, but I wondered if you'd had any thoughts on that.
Yes, I think, sort of, as I said in my opening remarks, I think one of the key messages which is coming through is that lack of certainty, and that does seem to be resulting in businesses holding off making decisions until they get that clarity. I think the unknown is whether that results in a sort of deadweight loss in that those businesses don't make investment decisions and they never come back and do it again, or once there is the certainty in place, whether they make those decisions but they're just delayed and we see an uptick in economic growth in the future. I mean, there's nothing in the evidence which will tell you one way or the other where that's going to go.
Any more questions? Oh, sorry, Bob first.
Thank you, Chair. Just to continue with Councillor Hunter's comments about the slight negativity in the report. I mean, if you look at page 22, paragraph 2.4, you don't quite say that Brexit or the potential Brexit is to do with the JSA increasing. How does that, first of all, can we get an idea of it? How does that compare with the national trends? Because my impression is that we're ahead in the wrong way of the national trends. And in which case, are we blaming that on Brexit? Are we blaming that on our abilities to create new jobs? What are we saying?
So in terms of the unemployment numbers, we are at an overall level we're ahead of the UK. So as a proportion of our population, we have more people unemployed than the national average. The change in unemployment levels fluctuates each month, but we've been broadly in line with the national average. I mean, we've been keen to present this is that we are not pinning anything definitively on or off the Brexit scenario. It's not possible at this stage to understand what's really driving these numbers, because there is just, globally Brexit is a significant event, but there are also other big global shifts which are going on in terms of the the slowdown in China, the trade wars which are starting between China and the US. These big global issues are going on, and they also have an impact on our economy. So not trying to dodge that question at all, but it's
not definitive, a bit more definitive about the reasons for it, then we can't solve the problem, can we? That's all that worries me. I mean, if it is Brexit, or the potential Brexit, so be it. What we can do about it is another matter. But we need to be a bit more definitive of why our GSA is going like that, and in which case then we can take the necessary actions to try and slow it down.
Yeah, well, I think job seeker allowance is going like that because the UK's economy is slowing down. I think whether the UK's economy is slowing down because of Brexit or another factor, I think that's where the debate is to be had.
Valerie.
Thank you. My apologies for being late. The tram from Rochdale was held up. I'm sorry, but I'm continuing the pessimistic note. There are conclusions in the report with the 4 bullet points on page 24 that point to some difficulties, shall we say, in engaging with national government about things that need to be done, but also things that could be done here in the Greater Manchester area. Can we have a brief report on progress with respect to those 4 bullet points, please?
Just bear with me one moment. I will bring those 4 bullet points up. So the first bullet point for members who haven't got the papers in front of them refers to the need for an integrated approach to skills to ensure that our residents have got the skills that employers need to navigate through Brexit. And there has been positive discussions on that with government. I think, as the panel has previously heard, we are a trailblazer for the local industrial strategy, and we're working with government at the moment to develop a joint statement with them, which we hope to release soon, which will set out where we're going to work together, and skills is likely to be one of those areas which government wants to work with us on. In terms of a full regional analysis jointly carried out between Greater Manchester and the government, we haven't made any progress on that yet. The government have committed to producing what they call an adequate analysis of the impact of a Brexit deal. That is something that they are doing themselves, and they will not share that. They've been public in saying that we will not share that because they feel it will weaken their negotiating position. That's not the decision that we agree with. We are engaging with the Department for the Exit in the European Union on that still, but I suspect that is something which is not going to change anytime soon. In terms of getting Greater Manchester and the North of England as a whole a voice in those negotiations, there are regular discussions now between the DEXU ministers and mayors and other leaders from principally from the mayoral combined authority areas. I think that those have. I think the feedback have been. The feedback that Andy Burnham provided to the last combined authority meeting suggested that those meetings were not the most useful, and they were not giving us the full voice that we want to have in that negotiation. In terms of returning powers to Greater Manchester from the European Union, that is something which is very still bound up in the negotiation, and will ultimately only be settled once the once that final agreement is reached with the European Union, we are speaking with both the Scottish and Welsh governments to understand what their positions are with the UK government, because they have a constitutional conversation with government about how those powers need to come back, and that's something that we want to be able to piggyback on the back of, but that is a longer term decision.
Karen?
Good afternoon. I just want to have your opinion on page 28, which is the key sector business investment, and it's the Greater Manchester Chamber of Commerce comments. I wonder if you could say how you feel about that. They seem quite positive, apart from the about the construction services, but they do seem to be quite positive about the way that business is going. So I wondered whether you could actually comment on that matter for me, please. Thank you.
I mean, my reading of the Chamber's survey, which is a survey of business perceptions, and the other ones that exist, is that most businesses are just getting on and doing the day job basically, and not particularly letting Brexit act as as something which is affecting their day-to-day decision making. If you look at the figures that we get from the Grove Company, more than half of firms think that their plans to hire or invest will remain the same post Brexit. So for most businesses, it's not a massive concern for them at this moment in time. I think the uncertainty and the risks are that over time does change, but there's nothing that comes through from that at this moment.
Thank you for that. So how do we feel that Greater Manchester, as an authority, can we actually benefit from that and make sure that, I know you've talked about the skills and how we need to make sure that we've got the right skills. How do you feel that you are actually how we are going to do that in the short term? Because we haven't got a very long time to actually get our people ready, because come what may, whatever happens, it's going to happen next year. And we're now up to July, and I just wondered how far Greater Manchester as an authority are we on the line to actually get our people geared up for whatever is going to happen.
Simon Noakes is here as who's responsible for skills policy at the combined authority, so you might want to say more than I can. I think this then sort of leads you to back to the Greater Manchester strategy, which is the overall approach to ensure that our residents are equipped for jobs for the future, and there's a broad work programme in place around skills and employment, which the committee's been updated on previously, so you'll be aware of that. I think the big shift which will be coming up from next year is the devolution of the adult education budget, which will specifically provide the authority with greater flexibility to be able to give residents more of the skills that employers are asking for. But I think we've also been clear in everything that we've said, but we think that is still too limited a set of tools to be able to really deal with the underpinning challenges that many of our residents face, and we don't believe it will give us a sufficient set of levers to be able to ensure that we can meet all those needs that employers have. And Simon, if there's anything you want to add to that.
I think John's been comprehensive in the answer. I guess there is no short, quick solution to the skills problem of this country. It's pretty endemic for a while, and it's going to take quite a long time to solve. And yes, we will leave next year, and there will obviously be transition arrangements in place, so it's not as if we're just going to suddenly everything is going to change on one day next year. But we have to make sure that we are beginning to train our residents in that. We're going to take a far more holistic approach to the whole of the skill education and skill system, and actually it's not just about skills in the workforce. It starts with education. It starts actually with our young people coming into our schools being school ready, and the learning that they have in schools, and then the skills that they get in the kind of 16 to 20 age period, and then the ongoing work with companies actually about companies actually investing more in the training and development of their staff, and actually one of the things that companies, and we're working with companies, is how they use the apprenticeship levy that they're often paying for larger companies, and how they use that to actually upskill their employees in the skills that are needed. So there's no ready solution, as John says, sorry, no quick solution. As John says, the devolutionary adult education budget will be the start of Greater Manchester being able to have a far more comprehensive approach around skills, but we still lack a lot of the powers that we need to make sure that we actually genuinely got the skills we need.
So, to a conclusion then, apart from a couple of questions that I've got, in fact one's really more of an observation. You use a very interesting word at the start of your presentation, if you like, contradictory evidence. And you're absolutely right. I mean, some of the measures that you've got in your overall report shows things going in the right direction compared to what we've had in the quite recent past. But then, of course, the growth rates are a bit of an issue. But then recently this week, I mean, there's been an update on that. So the 0.1% has been upgraded to 0.2% because the construction industry figures were all over the place. And secondly, for the next quarter, it's I think really 3% or 4%, 0.3% or 0.4%. So it is so difficult to actually do economic forecast in any situation. But when you've got all the extra determinants you've got here, it must be an absolute nightmare. So I'll ask you a very unfair question, actually, really. I mean, in terms of your analysis of what is likely to happen, are you being overly pessimistic or overly optimistic, do you think, in your judgment? Or do you think you've got the balance just about right?
I would like to say I've got the balance just about right. I think there's, as you say, we've all said there's a lot of noise in the data and a lot of contradictory messages, and economic forecasting is very imprecise science, as you can look back in history and see that. I think what is pretty clear is that if you increase barriers to trade, if you reduce access to markets, and if you limit the access to skills, that results in over a longer term in reduced growth. And I think that's what we will ultimately see if that's what the end Brexit result looks like. If we can maintain access to markets, reduce barriers to trade, ensure that businesses have ready access to the workforce that they need, then there's no reason why we shouldn't be more optimistic.
In this report, there is upside in there. A good example was the potential onshoring of the certain supply chains, which could well happen. But in the report, it does say on page 36, a deeper assessment of the implication of Brexit Greater Manchester is required. Now, I'm not quite sure what the timing of this report is, and if you've already done that as part of this update, or are you saying that an even further detailed update is required, and particularly, presumably, once the white paper has been approved or amended through Parliament?
Yes, I think we were trying to make a general point there, but that analysis was our first assessment based on the information we know, but it wasn't the definitive piece. We've also been clear that we think government needs to do a much deeper analysis itself, given that it's fronting up the negotiations, and it needs to have an understanding of those regional impacts. We are likely to update this analysis once we've been able to digest the white paper and start to see how we can strengthen the models on the basis of that. We haven't got a timing for that yet, but I would expect us to be doing that in the lead up to the meetings which will happen with the EU in October.
Okay. Thank you. The detail behind it is very, very helpful indeed, actually. So we're going back in the agenda now to the LEP, and to welcome Mike Blackburn, who's the chair of the Local Enterprise Partnership. And Mike, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Chair, and apologies for Simon and I being slightly tardy getting across town. Unfortunately, I apologise. So you have before you a very short paper on an update on the Local Enterprise Partnership. Some of it is historical in terms of how we set up and how we are run, but there's also an update there on some of the activities that we've been doing over the last 6 years and current activity, some of which was alluded to by John in the last session. So there are 38 local enterprise partnerships around the country, and each one, as they were set up with no framework by government. They were set up saying we need the business voice charged to draw up the economic growth strategy for each area, and the only prescription was you had to set yourselves up in what was called a functional economic geography, which for Greater Manchester, quite simple, all 10 local authorities. For other parts of the country, slightly more difficult. And I think they're up to about 20 local enterprise partnerships where they have local authorities in one or more LEPs, which doesn't make for a functional economic geography in my view, but that's a different matter. Manchester, as you know, has got great experience for 25 plus years in the private and the public working together, so much so that often we can't tell the difference between the two. And coherent. As I've just come from another meeting with Simon, for those of us who wander around the country doing various other activities, I can tell you that the things that go on here, both from a combined authority, the maturity of the local authorities and the integration of private and public is envied around the country, and one where other parts are now trying to emulate us. So charged with growing the economic strategy, we decided as a local enterprise partnership working with the combined authority that we'd only have one strategy. That might sound obvious. Many other places, the majority of the places, have got more than one economic strategy between the private and another one for the public, which just seems bizarre. And if you remember back in 2011, the core of that strategy was based around economic growth and the reform of public services. Again, why? Very simply from the private sector point of view is that the factors of production, skills, transport, housing, health are under the public funds, and you cannot divorce economic growth or economic strategy from those public assets. So we wanted to do both at the same time and have one single strategy. We have one single set of officers between the combined authority and the local enterprise partnership. We don't have two. So we set ourselves as a partnership body. The vast majority of other LEPs set themselves up as organisations which are limited by guarantee. So in other words, they are companies, and therefore they have to employ staff and spend most of their £500,000 of capacity funding employing people and paying for offices. The money that we have, the £500,000, is joined up with the combined authority money and sits to pay for the officer cadre and some other activities here in Greater Manchester. And we can direct some of that spend, not all of the spend. We agreed to have some of the spend just helping supporting the health and social care devolution, helping supporting the skills activities, and then we'll focus some of that spend directly in areas where we think we want to have a more significant focus. One of which is coming from our agenda a little bit later on, the internationalisation strategy for Greater Manchester. If you, as you go through the paper, you'll see something about our membership and governance. There's currently a LEP review going on by government, which is looking at the constitution, the governance arrangements, and the way LEPs are set up and run. We have 15 people on our board, 11 private sector, plus 2 ex officio, so 13 private sector and 4 public sector. Again, the only proviso from government came that you had to have a majority of private sector on the board with a chair from the private sector. And I can tell you that there are some LEPs around the country with 32 people on their board, 16 private and 16 public, and the casting vote is the chair. We've never had a vote, but again, the 13.4 tells you the maturity of the places where we live and work, that this is a much more mature place than anywhere else. And you have a list of the 4 public sector and the 13 private sector in your paper. If you go on to strategy and development, has already been mentioned by John about the local industrial strategy. The LEP is front and centre with the combined authority and the officers in trying to help develop the local industrial strategy. To help with that, we have set up something called a foresight group, which is bringing 30 internationally and domestically reputed individuals with an age range of something like 21 through to 82, I think it is, on that group, from politicians to company leaders to startups to voluntary organisations, to think about the kind of 10 to 30 year strategy for this city region, about what are the big rocks in the road coming ahead of us. Might sound that's a bit fanciful, but if you think about an ageing population and you want to change anything around housing, transport, or even the skills activity, that will often take a minimum 5 to 10 years before you can have any impact whatsoever. So we're trying to think and learn from what's going on around the world, as well as influence what goes on around the world around those things like artificial intelligence, ageing, social mobility, and decarbonisation. We've also done things like get involved in a Transport 2040 draft and strategy. So there's many things that we will get involved with. Another one that we own, which will affect every one of our areas in the 10 local authorities, we developed a manufacturing strategy because it hadn't been done in Greater Manchester before. So first having a look at how many manufacturers we have, about 6,500 manufacturing companies in Greater Manchester. The average size is 16 people. The modal number is 10. So it tells you that we have a lot of companies who are all very small. And in simple terms, many things came out of that, but one of which was a distinct lack of developing leaders in those areas. So a lot of small companies who just don't know how to lead their company through change or through growth or through sustainability or just survival in some cases. So we set up something called the Manufacturing Institute to start looking at how to get the large companies to help the small companies with capacity to be able to develop that leadership capability so our smaller companies can survive and grow. If you go through some of the other things that we've been doing in there, the Business Growth Hub and the Working Well activities, a lot of good things that we've been doing, many of which are now being copied around the country. If you're going to, not stopping here, however, recognising our position in Greater Manchester and the Local Enterprise Partnership has an impact on the economy and social impact on the rest of the north of England in particular. I've certainly been pushing for the last 14 months, pulling all the LEP chairs together from the north of England, all 11 of us, driving a consistency and programme of activity to help and support each other. So all our growth hubs have been getting together and sharing best practice. We've been learning from things going on in Liverpool. They've been learning from us growing in Tees Valley. The automotive supply chain industry have been connected through Cheshire and Newcastle area, where they both have strong car manufacturers. So we've been trying to get the growth hubs working in a more consistent framework and pushing that across. And it was announced last week that the NP11 will be a formalised body now that the government will look to help shape economic strategy for the north of England, with some, again, capacity funding for about £500,000 for that group to come together, working alongside the politicians for the north of England as well. And Greater Manchester, myself and Greater Manchester have been asked to lead on trade and investment for the north of England. So that's an international strategy as well as an inward investment strategy for the north of England. So a lot going on there. Again, finally, as you know, I think that the LEPs are now a partnership part of the Transport for the North, which is reconstituted a few months ago as a statutory body, which the politicians will run that as a statutory body, but they've invited all 11 LEP chairs to come on as partners for that board, so there is a business voice on Transport for the North board. And yes, we've all been through those last painful sessions of the last few months with Northern Rail and timetable initiatives. Finally, transparency and accountability. Following the Mary Nay review that's been going on, all LEPs have been undergone some scrutiny to look at are we transparent or are we not. We've also had what's called an annual conversation with government, where we found out after the event you are going to be graded, a bit like Ofsted. They didn't tell us beforehand, they didn't tell us how you're graded, but we found out afterwards. It's safe to say that with only one small exception, which is our website, was not fully up to date. The rest was given a clean bill of health from outstanding to good in between those two markings. But we've always had since day one, our meetings have been in public. Part A's have been in public, always have been, and we do have members of the public who wander in from time to time. Most are not lost. They do genuinely want to come in. We always hold them in the public, and then we have a Part B session for obvious reasons. And then the governance arrangements are typical of, as you would expect, all papers are published 5 days in advance, and the minutes and other notes are published 5 days in arrears as well. So we're in a pretty good position. We don't think the LEP review will come out with anything substantive that is negative towards Manchester, with one exception we're questioning at the moment as to whether they want us to be constituted differently, and that might be as an accountable, as a company limited by guarantee. We're pushing back on that, saying that with the mayoral combined authorities and what's going on in those, they are much more mature, and a partnership board is much more appropriate, and let the mayoral combined authorities choose their own ways of going about doing what's happening. And actually, if Manchester is as good as everybody keeps telling us, why do you want to change us? So hopefully they won't push anything back against Manchester and the way we are constituted. So apart from that, that's everything that's going on in the LEP world at the moment. And if there's any questions, then happy to take them.
Thank you, Matt, for that very interesting presentation. And well, I suppose congratulations in terms of the assessment so far. So let's hope nothing else changes. but it is a bit naughty given that the input that they're going to do the marking after the event. But shall we? Right. Open question then. Kate first, please.
Obviously, a lot of the work you do, obviously, it is about improving growth, improving productivity, that kind of thing, businesses. But very important on, I know from my local authority for one, but I'm sure across Greater Manchester, is about inclusive growth and trying to get more social value from that growth instead of just seeing it as an end in itself. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about the importance, the priorities on your agenda in terms of social value and inclusive growth. Thank you.
Of course we can do that. And so let me take two aspects of that. One is the pure economic aspect. And the economic aspect would be that we're, as an economy, because we have lower attainment in GCSEs, we have a relatively unhealthy population by average UK standards, and across every measure, if we're below average, from a just pure economic point of view, we need to do something about that. And therefore, that has to be about how do we change the nature of what we've got in our own local areas rather than importing the answer from anywhere else. So hugely supportive of both the Working Well programme and the Working Well initiative within the Skills and Working Group. We have both the LEP members and private sector members on that skills panel and have been since it started in 2011, 2012. Pushing that further though, with the Mayor and endorsing what the Mayor has been doing about having, and I can't remember the exact words, it's like a good business charter. Is that what it's going to be called? Employment charter. An employment charter is to encourage all businesses to think about how they become a better employer in their area. How do they become more inclusive, have a diversity policy, how do they get more social value by following in the frameworks that local authorities are doing by having 10% of the markings on social value within their contracts. So we've been pushing, saying that's a good thing to be doing, working with the GMCVO to ensure that as we go forward, not all the answers are in big companies, not all the answers are in public sector. The voluntary organisations have a huge part to play in things like skills improvement and in health and social care, particularly in the social care end of the devolution aspect. So very much behind it and at the heart and centre of driving those policies as well.
Just to so you're aware, we are having we have a task and finish group which I'm leading on the employment chart, and we're actually saying before the meeting that we would like to have at some point a detailed discussion with you about your involvement in that. So obviously too much for here, but we'll come back to you if that's okay. Thank you.
Well made point. I think Ray's next.
Thank you, Chair. Quite an open question, mine really. If you didn't exist, the businesses would still be growth. There'd still be growth in the economy. Manchester would still be going forward. So how can you evidence best value and success with what you put into Greater Manchester?
So let me answer the question in a different way. If we didn't exist, we actually existed before we existed.
Right.
So Greater Manchester, so that's a really obtuse way of... So before LEPs were formed, we had something called the Commission for Economic Development, Employment and Skills. Private sector dominated, private sector led. So back to my point, this is in the DNA of what we do in Greater Manchester. So we've always had the private sector helping to drive economic strategy, leading and supporting Marketing Manchester, leading and supporting MIDAS, the investment organisation. So we've already had it.
Right.
So can we evidence what the LEP has done? So if you take things like the growth deals that were done, that was the 4 elected leaders, the chair and the 3 vice chairs of the combined authority, and myself were down presenting to, I think it was 20 government ministers at the point. We were the only place who went down on phase 1 that had any business person in front of the ministers. Most of the rest didn't even take any politicians. They took officers. We decided Greater Manchester would take 5, and we took 4 politicians and myself. Now, you might argue I didn't add any value at that table. I think I added some great value at that table, partly in saying that the private and the public work coherently together, as evidenced by us coming together. And I presented the political angle, actually, to Kate's point, the social inclusion angle, rather than letting the politicians do it, and they presented the economic angle, the business angle, to prove that we were joined up, not doing our own little pieces. And that is unique to Manchester. Nobody else will do it that way at all. So other things we've done, our growth hub is regarded as the best in the country, leading the way. It's always hard to say, would these things have been done anyway? That was new, so we bid for money, and that is driving it. I think we've been driving Tim and his internationalisation strategy with the Manchester China Forum, started through conversation between the LEP and Midas, and now the Manchester India Partnership, which you're going to hear a bit more about later on. So again, if we hadn't been around, would those have happened? You don't know. But have we added value to those conversations? I would argue we've not only added value, we've driven them. The final one was Simon's sick of me saying this, but so when we did the Greater Manchester Strategy and it came to the LEP, all the LEP members were pushing very hard back, saying, good strategy, but poor implementation plan. Go away and work on the implementation plan, but be aware of what we call upstream and downstream activity. Don't isolate activities and kind of shrink wrap them, because they have impact upstream and downstream. And so the team, under Simon's guidance, worked extremely hard. We came back with a really brilliant implementation plan that looked at all those, and then got hugely thanked for it, and then told you it was too much detail, so you can't win. So I think that challenge, though, so one thing most business people are very good at is business planning, and I think that the value that we added to the officers at that point, and the challenge that we add in a supportive way, in a helpful way, by giving extra people, extra capacity from our own organisations, within the business community, working with the chambers and working with other organisations, I think helped drive that to a better place than it is today.
Thank you.
Great question. And great answer as well, actually, I have to say. And just to reinforce the point, I mean, I used to be a partner in KPMG, and I'm aware that over the years, particularly with Manchester City Centre, the amount of work that went on with the council, I should say, the amount of work went on between business and the politicians was the reason why Manchester is where it is today, and it's great to see that's been developed for the whole of Greater Manchester. So you make some very good points, actually, Mike. Very good points. So next, I think it's Mark, and then Susan, and then Bob.
Okay, thanks, Chair. It's a good report, and there's obviously lots of very good work going on, and there has been for a long time. So I want to get that out up front. And as you said yourself, Mike, the relationships. I think you described the standing of the LEP here as mature on more than one occasion by comparison to what happens in other parts of the country. And I think it's fair to say that in other parts of the country, relationships between local government, whether it's a combined authority as we have here in Greater Manchester or individual councils, is not always quite as harmonious it is here in Greater Manchester. It's a good thing from our point of view that we have that closer working relationship. And I think you have emphasised that both in your introduction and in the report. I just wonder, flipping that over, do you see any negatives at all about having such a close working relationship? Because as I understand it, in other parts of the country, the LEPs do like to see themselves not entirely separate, but certainly being independent of the local authority, whatever it might be. And I do wonder sometimes, that's why I'm asking you, is there any downside to that? Do you ever feel that there's a danger of getting almost too close, or do you think your integrity as a separate organisation, which you are, is guaranteed in all circumstances? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you for that. So, if there's a single negative, it will be around people's perception of Greater Manchester. And even both how you all 10 work together, which, by the way, to your point, Mark, not only is it great to see all 10 working together, but that gives business huge confidence in Greater Manchester that things will get done effectively. So that's extremely good. But the one downside could be that people look at it and say, which is stitch up from the outside. It looks like it's just too close. But actually, when you get to come and talk to us, and when you get to come to some of the meetings, there are huge discussions, mature discussions, and points of difference. And we had some great points of difference around the transport strategy, because we want transport to be an outcome-led activity, not a put some stuff down and see what happens activity. And so we do have massive challenges. But I think we would probably argue that if there are any negatives, the positives outweigh the negatives for that change, because you flipped it and you lost that trust and authenticity. The deeply negative impact will be you'll be the same as everywhere else. To your point, they are not coherent and therefore make decisions outside of each other. So I would have been coming here today potentially. Actually, I wouldn't be coming here today because we wouldn't be scrutinised in some cases. But if I was, I would be coming here today telling you what we're going to do. Not reporting what we have done together, because bear in mind, it's a part, as I keep telling other LEPs around the country, you're a partnership body in everything but name between private and public. It's not them and us. So I think the positive outweigh. The final one will be every time we get an international visitor, whether it's of a civic dignitary or a business leader, they are absolutely blown away by the integrated governance and decision-making arrangements that happen here in Greater Manchester, to the credit of Manchester. So I think we'd lose more by flipping to a different structure. And legally, if we form the company, I'd be accountable to the board of directors at that point, and to my fiduciary duty to the balance sheet, and to the company and ethos, not to the social value aspect. And we couldn't necessarily be talking about inclusive growth as much as we do, because that wouldn't necessarily be good on the balance sheet. We'd have to do something completely different. So the only negative I can see is perception. The other negative, by the way, is jealousy.
Are you happy with that, Mark?
I am happy with the answer, but just very quickly, just as Mike pointed out that there was a forerunner to the LEP and that this work has actually been going on in this area for much longer time than the LEPs existed. I think it's fair to point out that joint working between the 10 Greater Manchester districts didn't start with a combined authority. And those of us that are old enough to remember AGMA will remember how successful that was. And we used to get exactly the same reaction from friends around the country that said, what, you get all 10 chief executives and 10 leaders in the same room every month? How does that happen? And it's still the case. People do fail to grasp just how important that is. So I don't want you to think, as so many do, that history only started with the formation of the combined authority. It goes back a little bit longer than that. But thanks for the answer. Yeah.
No, so I'm well aware. In fact, Simon and I were just doing another presentation earlier on where we only went back to 2008. But we equally referenced going back to 1996 and the formation of AGMA and the various things along the way. And I think, hugely important point to make, nowhere in the country would have got health and social care devolution without that authenticity and combination of private-public working together, particularly the public working together, not just the local authorities, but the other constituted bodies, whether healthcare trust, chief constable, fire, your 36, 37, 38, whatever it is, organisations who get together regularly. That's, again, absolutely because of the 25, 35 years of history, of evidential history of public working together, then public and private working together. So, absolutely. We're mutually slapping each other on the back.
And we should be very proud of it. Very proud. There are lots of good things in Greater Manchester. Susan.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be conscious of time. Some people talk of global brand companies taking profit from the local economy, so we're back to balance sheets and profits there. Can you speak to what is felt to be the right balance on companies, please? And can small firms in Greater Manchester be grown more into medium firms or large firms? What's the role of the LEP in that? And if that happens, can that fill more of the local economy? Is that something that we could anticipate for the future?
Just do me a favour, Susan, please. Just say the very first one again.
Okay. The first point is that there are people who speak to, if you like, the global brands, the big business in Greater Manchester, who can be seen to be taking profit finance out of the local economy. So could the future be that the LEP, others have a role in the growth of, I want you to speak to basically what the state of things could be in terms of companies, and is there a possibility that small companies could grow further into medium size and even larger companies, and is that one way of perhaps keeping more of the finance in the local economy in the future?
So I get so look at two different points. Let me take the first one. So global brands, assuming they're good brands, are in essence themselves attractive proposition to have in a Greater Manchester context, both from an employability point of view, a personal spending point of view, a local taxation point of view. There's stuff in there, and we don't have any FTSE 100, 250, 350 companies based in Manchester. I think we've only got one in the northwest, which I think is United Utilities. So we do, to John's earlier report, we do extremely well in our economy despite not having, or you could argue, in spite of having one, we do even better. But we do work close with our global brands. So JLR just announced that they're coming into Manchester. We've got people on my board from Siemens UK, the chief executive of Siemens UK, sitting on the board, as well as lots of local businesses, small businesses sitting on the board. So as long as we are collaborative in how we go about doing things, yes, we can use that global brand. I think it's a different question about whether taxation should be raised locally or not locally and how it's retained, and most of what you retain goes into the central government anyway, and then some comes back, which is prescriptive, and others doesn't come back at all. But we have to use those global brands on an individual basis, I think. Your second point, actually, is almost going to say, watch this space. The reason for that is we set up 4 task and finish groups about 9 months ago, and the last one to report is about what we call scale-ups. Yeah. So that's reporting on Monday, and that scale-ups is looking at exactly that. How do you take small companies and grow them? And the papers are in the public domain now, so I can tell you that it will be a hugely positive paper that tells you we will, and some actions that we are recommending that we put into place to take up what is a small company, apply some of those activities to it, and then grow. And so the aim is to grow those through that kind of scale-up activity. So there is a direct aim of doing that. But then we also work with things like the Manufacturers Federation, the Automotive Federation, the Engineering Employers activity, Pro Manchester, the Chamber, Federation of Small Business, to work with those organisations to see how we can help them grow. And finally, we've also had some huge amounts of money that we bid for into central government and apply through our Growth Hub activity to apply as loans to small companies. The vast majority have been repaid and constantly repaid. So we're churning out money and we're recycling it roughly every 3 years, so every 3.5 years. So money going out, coming back in, and they will only get money loaned to them if it is about retaining or growing employability. And yes, we have lost some. Some have still gone to the wall, I'm afraid, but very low numbers. And the vast majority have grown, have done what they said they're going to do, and we'll continue to keep loaning out to them as well.
Susan just noted to me, actually, we can organise for some links to some of the LEP reports, which might be very helpful, actually. Bob.
Chair. Can we talk about apprenticeships? I mean, my personal limited knowledge is that we had a really good spike of apprenticeships, 2010, 11, 12, 13. As a governor of a sixth form, brand new college, vocational, we took a real hit because of apprenticeship scheme was so well in the combined authority or in AGMA, whatever. How do you see it going forward in the CA in terms of progress? Because obviously, as we become an independent country going forward, they are vital aspects of our trade.
Thank you. So at a personal level and a business level, apprenticeships are hugely important to us. And I think as a country, we've lost our way with apprenticeships over the last 20 years, and they've been not denigrated, but put below the capacity for a degree, which I think is wrong. It is an appropriate move from a young person to get into the world of work. I've got 2 sons, one of whom did a degree and the other one did an apprenticeship. And for both, it was the right move for them to make. So we have a number of things we need to do. One of which is we need to inspire a generation of young kids and their families that there are different pathways which have equal importance and equal relevance to them, and is the right pathway for the young person to go on. And our skills and our working group are already working with the Employers Hub and with the Careers and Advice guidance for young kids in schools to start that process. We're also using through what's called Bridge GM, getting businesses connected into the world of schools to try and help inspire a generation of young people and their families that apprenticeships are a really good, positive way of doing it. And some of them, MMU are leading the way in the UK on this by having degree apprenticeships. So you can still get a degree without having the £9,000 per year debt in there as well. It's just a different approach. It was right and relevant for the young people. And you've also got traineeships or direct employment. So there's different modes of getting to the world of work. I think the difficulty we've got is that not a lot of that is under our control from the combined authority point of view. The adult skills budget we might get control over, but not the young people. And DFE are resisting slightly. Most LEPs trying to get involved with schools to help them support that push and that drive, but we will do it anyway. I think the numbers out today for the apprenticeship levy show that the country England as a nation is behind where it needs to be to get the 3 million apprenticeships by 2020. So it seems to me that there'll be underspend in that taxation that's been raised for the apprenticeship levy, which will not be applied to apprenticeships. So quite a lot of places, including Greater Manchester, are looking at, we're actively thinking about, should we be putting a proposition to government, say that money could be spent differently into the supply chain mechanism of small companies to help them get an apprenticeship in a different economic model to the current one, which tends to be beneficial to the larger organisations who've got big HR departments and are taking on dozens of apprenticeships anyway. So we have to work on a different model of how we do it. So inspire at one end, different model of engagement at the other end, and try and get a different funding mechanism where we can.
Thank you very much. I've just got two small questions. The first one is, where do you see your problem in the future? And the second one is, what would you say was or is your most successful result?
So, as a generalisation, one of the biggest problems I think we're facing is uncertainty. Businesses like nothing better than to know what's going to happen in the future. And whether it's Brexit discussions, whether it's trade discussions, whether it's financing of future skills, we've got an ageing population, we've got an underskilled population, we've got an unhealthy population, and we're not in control of any of those things at a national level in a way that's consistent with places that are below national average. Our devolution helps that. But on the trade, I think most businesses would say, we just need to know for the next 2 or 3 years what the certainty of the conditions are in the market, which means you can either invest, or you stabilise, or you downsize in some cases. So I would say that of all things that are not under our control, that's the biggest one that worries most businesses. Can we get some form of stability for the next few years? And I think on the other side, certainly one of the things that we're most proud of is saying the Growth Hub is one of those, of the thousands of businesses, tens of thousands of individual people we've helped get back into the world of work or be more sustainable, grow, or access to new markets. Winning national awards. The director for that has just won another award himself as a leader of change for Greater Manchester in that area. So that, I think, had a huge impact on the people of Greater Manchester and the businesses of Greater Manchester as well.
Any more questions? I've got a couple. You refer in your report to the creation of some task and finish groups, and it's 4 generic headings really: schools, digital skills, business startups and scale up, and adopting digital technologies. Now, I presume within that you're looking at specific aspects of those areas. And rather than giving an answer now, it'd be helpful to know what sort of things you are doing there. Because, of course, these are the areas that we're responsible for in terms of open scrutiny. And it might just inform some of the things that we want to challenge. If you think you've got an area that you're concerned with, that's why you've got a task and finish group, I think that could help us, actually. So if you could share that information with us. But also, are you using outside expertise to help you within those task and finish groups?
So answer your first one, we can definitely get the connection with the papers. All the papers are apart. Oh no, the scale-up papers should be on the current papers for Monday. So they're all there. And by nature of task and finish group, by the way, so some will have a task and finish group in the finish, and therefore will be a rollout of activity. Other might say, do you know what, we found other people are already doing that kind of work. So in the schools work, which is about business engagement, Bridge GM is now pushing ahead on that. And we're saying yes. So that's the first one. So what was the second question again?
To supplement, if you like, the task and finish groups.
Right, yeah. So the task and finish groups will always be led by 1 or 2 people from the LEP itself, and supported by 1 or 2 officers as well. But then what they will normally do is bring other business or voluntary organisations into that room to have conversations. And it could be anything from half a dozen to several dozen people coming together. The Scale-Up one, for example, is using the Scale-Up Institute materials. It's using some of the university materials. So it's drawing in other things from other areas, other evidence, and also talking to other growth hubs to find out other places around the country. So if they're doing it better than us, we've got to learn.
That's a great answer. The other thing is, I'm not sure if you can answer this, because it might be commercially sensitive. And if you can't, then fine. But I'm really interested in the work you've been doing with Cheshire East, I think it's Cheshire East anyway, on Alderley Park. Now, Alderley Park used to be one of the most fantastic R&D places in the whole of the British Isles until AstraZeneca, if you like, took its lock, stock and barrel down to Cambridge. But it's a massive park there, and it's not just, if you like, the R&D. It's also all the admin stuff there, because there was their corporate headquarters of AstraZeneca, apart from obviously where the main board was based in London. And just like to understand what the opportunities are for there, because it just strikes me as a great potential, and working together with Cheshire East could unlock some fantastic opportunities there.
So I would argue that actually one of the biggest success stories in the last 5 or 6 years of 2 places working coherently together. So within moments of that and being announced by AstraZeneca's board, in a couple of days there was a commission set up between Manchester and Cheshire East to go and act with the private sector and universities to go and actively look at what could we do there to make it more coherent and not lose 2,500 brilliant scientists. So sit here today 4 years later. That park is now owned by Manchester Science Partnership through Bruntwood, with the University of Manchester, with Manchester City Council on behalf of the Combined Authority and Cheshire East, with some government money put into it. There's a pot of money there. It now employs more people on site than it ever did when AstraZeneca were there. They are focusing on things, some real pressing things like precision medicine, life sciences, connecting around the world, not just in Alderley Park. But the best thing I think they've done there is embed it into the Manchester corridor of activity in the health informatics, the health sciences, life sciences stuff going on. So it's not a disconnected set of investigations. It's now connected into our health and social care devolution stuff that's going on. And potentially the question on scale-ups as well is how do you take some of those startups out in there and scale them through to be much bigger than they are and move them off-site. The quicker we can get them off-site, the quicker they can grow even faster. And some really good, brilliant organisations based in there now.
And that is very encouraging. I'm particularly bearing in mind, if you like, it's one of the, if you like, priorities for growing the strategy within Greater Manchester. So that's excellent. Mark?
Just to put on record, Chair, my wife works for AstraZeneca, and as you mentioned them, I felt, I don't know if that's a declarable interest or not, but I felt I should err on the safe side on this. Thank you.
I'll let the officers decide on that. But yeah, belt and braces is a good way. And the last point is when the output has come from the government review, the Ofsted type of review, it'd be helpful if you could just share with us just a very high level sort of what things are you going to change, not interest in the actual report, but how you're reflecting what they've said in terms of your modus operandi, if anything at all, of course.
Happy to do that, and we'll pick that up as soon as we hear the left review, which should be hopefully, fingers crossed, the next 2 weeks, but who knows.
Well, Mike, thankfully that was really encouraging with things that are taking place. And as I say, and I got particularly, as you can see, interest in Alderley Park, as they used to be one of my clients a long, long time ago. So that's not declarable. And So, we look forward to having some more reports from you in due course, and if there's anything we can do to help, call us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
On to the internationalisation strategy implementation plan update, and we've got John Stewart and Tim Nunes. And Tim is the Chief Executive of Midas.
That's great. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. So we presented the internationalisation strategy to this committee back in December last year, and it was agreed that we would report back following a mid-term review. To be honest, it was hoped that we might have a little bit more clarity about Brexit by the time we actually came to this process. But I think the view expressed by this committee in December still applies, that we should focus on those things that we can control in terms of internationalisation, rather than try and second-guess UK policy outcomes on Brexit, but at the same time seek to influence those, as John Holden was talking about earlier. And to be fair, that's how we've actually approached it. So, in the report, we've highlighted a number of key successes, in particular the fantastic success of Manchester Airport, particularly over the last 2 years, which has seen 46% increase in business numbers and 31% increase in passenger numbers for leisure as well. So it's been a major success over that time. Tourism is up 31%. And I'm sure Tim will reference this, inward investment as a comparator to the rest of the UK. 6.1% of inward investment comes here from across the UK. And the initial target was 5% for the whole of the strategy. So despite everything, we've been really successful. And as John alluded to, trade exports have held up well, an increase in GM by 16% over that period of time. But Brexit has created an uncertainty, and a lot of this is around sentiment. So whilst tourism has done well over the last 2 years, there's been Visit Britain have said that there's kind of an 11% fall in advance bookings, looking forward. So a lot of this is around the sentiment. Universities reporting that international students have actually held up in terms of numbers, but that again the sentiment is kind of, in terms of uncertainty, and this issue of welcome. Is the UK welcoming? I think it's giving play on minds. If we are locked out of major EU investment research programmes, then it's going to have an impact upon a lot of the work of the university, particularly Manchester University. And one of the measures within the strategy was that we would look to the reputation of the university to increase. In fact, all the universities across Greater Manchester increased through the strategy period. And the uncertainty over that, and what is the outcome, I suppose, in terms of associate membership, which the UK is looking for, we will need to watch closely. Uncertainty about immigration policy is also of concern, but we note in the white paper the mobility framework that is proposed, which seems to be a direction of travel that may help to address that. And in terms of the businesses attracting international talent, where there are skills gaps, there are some issues kind of emerging from that, which I think in terms of salary threshold, I think, Tim, you might talk a little bit about that. So it was within this framework that we put together the 18-month half-term plan, if you like, that takes us to the end of 2020. And it's drawn from a much more detailed spreadsheet in terms of the detailed implementation plan that has been done. It kind of pulls out some of the highlights of that. The back of this report is a kind of performance summary report that rag rates progress against the 8 priorities within the strategy. There's one column around Brexit, and there's one around the outcomes that we're looking to deliver. And I think across those, 4 of the priorities are on course for delivery. The other 4 are behind but recoverable. And the latest data, though, on the 2 that we've identified as kind of amber, if you like, on inward investment and trade is quite encouraging. So it's pointing in the right direction. Where there are concerns is really around the other two, which are more directly connected with Brexit, around strengthening our research capabilities and talent base, and being the best destination for international students. So I think with that point, I'd just like to bring Tim in, really perhaps to talk about just to kind of touch on the salary threshold issue and what you're finding in practice in terms of the inward investment in Greater Manchester and sentiment.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think we've obviously seen a lot of business expansion over the last 2 years in particular. And so we are starting to see costs rising across Greater Manchester, but particularly in the conurbation core, if you like, in the city centre. So we're seeing extra pressure on property prices, particularly office prices in the central core. We've seen increases of probably upwards of 20% plus over the last 3 or 4 years as that demand picks up, essentially. And likewise, we've started to see some early signs of wage inflation as well, particularly in sectors like technology, digital skills, just because of the sheer sort of demand for those skills at the levels we're seeing. So I think that's changing the dynamics of Greater Manchester slightly. We're obviously trying to adjust. We know that there are, again, some of these things are isolated geographically within Greater Manchester. So as costs go up in the centre, how do we start to leverage some of the cost advantages of the wider areas of Greater Manchester? And that, to an extent, is a slight challenge where you have large international firms who want to be at the centre of transport hubs. How do we actually bring them outside from those, and if you like, a safe distance so that they can still fulfil some of their ambitions around access to talent, but leveraging those cost differentials of the wider Greater Manchester area, if you like. So we sort of sometimes describe Greater Manchester as a product, because essentially it is when we're selling that to investors, and therefore there is a slight changing nature of the Greater Manchester product at the same time as the external factors that we're experiencing in terms of economic uncertainty as well. And I suppose the positive slant of that, when you look at the GMS, is that these are higher value jobs that are coming in, which is obviously the absolute desire of the GMS to do that. And our challenge is then to be able to fulfil the volumes that we're keen to still attract at that higher level and from an inclusive growth perspective. So there are sort of challenges, I suppose, across the board in that respect. I think, as John said, really, I mean, the wider strategy, you know, a huge part of this strategy is us being able to deliver this international strategy as a team. And we've heard Mike Blackburn really talk about that public-private partnership, and that, again, is inherent within this piece of work. So if you think of a sort of concentric circle or onion in terms of, you know, several layers, this strategy directs all the public agencies as to which markets and which sectors to focus on, and in which of the 8 pillars to focus on. But what that then does is give our sort of inner stakeholders, if you like, or inner partners like the universities, you know, some of the semi-public agencies, even the football clubs, to be honest, in that inner circle, it gives them guidance of where we can go at these international markets together. And then likewise, the next layer, which is the private sector, again, have guidance. So where we've had the Manchester China Forum, which has been going for about 4 years now, Manchester India Partnership, which launched earlier this year, it's created this team approach to international market development that helps everyone. So looking at the flight development, the new route development at Manchester Airport, as I say, adding India in May this year was a fantastic feather in the cap. But again, through complete joint work between the airport, who obviously lead on it, but the likes of ourselves, people like the Confederation of Indian Industry, who are part of the Manchester India Partnership, who helped set up meetings with the aviation minister in India for the airport and ourselves, Deloitte supporting behind that with contacts that they had in the field. So all those partners within that partnership that have a clear single strategy for Greater Manchester that we're all working on together as a team makes us obviously infinitely more powerful than doing it all in isolation. So I think the strategy overall has helped dramatically in that context, and that's why we're really starting to see that greater success in the individual components of it as well.
Thanks, Tim. In terms of the next step, obviously as part of this review, we did undertake a significant amount of consultation. We're keen to add to that in the light of the white paper, and certainly in terms of the further engagement with the LEP and the universities. So that is the next stage. The intention then is to finalise this plan and take it to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority meeting at the end of September.
Questions? Susan, and then Mark.
Thank you, John and Tim. I've got a couple. Now, the first is the United Arab Emirates is one of the GM6 key global markets. So I've read the report and I didn't see much mention of it in this report. Firstly, are social and human rights issues considered at Manchester City Council at all? I saw something on social media from one of the councillors to suggest it might be. Sorry to ask you, we've no politicians here, have we? No politicians here today. But let me ask this as well. Is United Arab Emirates, is it mainly about increasing Greater Manchester exports, or are there other economy matters? So that's my question on United Arab Emirates, whatever you want to say on that. The second question, which I'll go to, is what is also going on? Can you tell me just a bit more? Mainly because of all this uncertainty over how Brexit's going to affect us. So what's going on? Can you say more about the monitor markets? It's quite a list now. I sort of honed in more in December on the 6th. Australia, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, South Korea, Nigeria and Brazil. But it's a much longer list now. I know, sorry, some of this is colour scored. Would you give me any more information you can on these monitor markets? Anything you want to say on that? But United Arab Emirates first. Thanks.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah, I could probably take that initially. I mean, what this exercise that you'll all see in terms of the various styles, it's like sort of the operations department of a nuclear power station to an extent. What that was there to do was to really understand on multiple factors what our strongest market opportunities were, really. So some of that is about market scale, market growth, all those factors. You know, their propensity to outwardly invest. So, for example, Brazil was on the last version of this sort of 3 years ago, up till 2017. That dropped off because A, they went into an economic decline, and B, their propensity to outwardly invest was incredibly low. They were very focused on the domestic economy. So there's a number of factors that then start to rank these things, and obviously you've got the dark green areas there that show the strength of relationship. But there are then also sort of slightly more subtle factors, if you like, which are around our existing connections to different places as well, and the extra advantage that gives us in a relationship with that country. So in terms of, you know, if you just did UAE on a pure market growth, market scale, all those factors, it probably wouldn't have crept into that top 6. But on the basis of existing relationships, existing investment, that sort of influence that we have there, that's why it essentially got elevated above some of the other nations that you might see there. And that is about utilising the assets and relationships that we have as a city region. So with the Abu Dhabi investment that went into Manchester City Football Club, that then spurred a relationship between Abu Dhabi and Manchester City Council initially, which then started to grow in terms of how that actually connects into the wider Greater Manchester. And what that brought was essentially, obviously, probably the £1 billion that's gone into Manchester City Football Club and the wider regeneration itself there, but then a further £1 billion in housing in East Manchester, £250 million into university accommodation, and about £30 million in investment into the Graphene Engineering and Innovation Centre. So we've used that initial relationship and sort of strategic influence, if you like, to then leverage a number of different aspects from it. And also Etihad Airways, connectivity, which gives us connectivity into Asia, into Australasia. Etihad set up its European headquarters here. So, all these things were about leveraging how that, through that window, if you like, we could achieve so much more. So that's why the UAE is there.
Well,
it's much more,
sorry.
sorry to interrupt, I don't normally interrupt. So it's much more, that descriptor is much more an inward investment. Oh, I'm so sorry, I thought it was still on. That description tells me, am I right then, that it's much more about inward investment into GM from United Arab Emirates than it is. I remember in December we had that top line that talked about export, where we were looking at value of export and so on. But I've just heard from you that there's significant inward investment that's already been placed and is active in Greater Manchester, and that places it in the top 6.
So yes, that's definitely a factor that's accelerated it, but we would still have absolute ambitions around trade equally. But very often, the sort of sequence, if you like, very often investment follows trade actually, but in this case, it's been slightly the other way around. But certainly, the international trade team here have regular missions that go out to the Middle East and UAE, and therefore, and likewise, there's a huge tourism programme that Marketing Manchester are running with GCC, that whole area as well. And, with Emirates flying 3 A380s a day now from Manchester to Dubai, likewise Etihad 3 times a day, Qatar twice a day, and some of the other sort of surrounding airlines such as Turkish Airlines and Saudi Arabia, Singapore, so that whole region is very, very well served, including the sort of UAE itself.
Mark? Yeah, thanks, Chair. I want to focus on one particular part of this. It's on page 5 or 49, depending on your preference, the bit under inward investment that relates to MIPIM. I asked about this when we had the report in December, and I want to pursue it a little bit further today. Firstly, can I check? You mentioned that 6 of the 10 authorities were present in 2017. I understood that Stockport was also there for the first time in 2017, so should that read 7 of the 10? Or?
Yes, and that may well just be an oversight, to be honest, but there's a slight, all 10 are represented fully as part of the MIPIM showcase, if you like. It's just a record of which of those local authorities might have gone in at a sponsorship level. It's possibly a subtle difference.
Well, I'd like, through you, Chair, not necessarily now, but for that to be clarified, because I understand from our Chief Executive that we sent a delegation. There were certainly 3 senior council officers that were present there. I noticed that across Greater Manchester we sent 274 delegates. I'd be interested to know if it's possible to find out how many of those were local authority employees. Let me say all of this is predicated on a ready acceptance that MIPIM is an international shop window, and I understand we have to be out there and selling ourselves. But I think it's also, there is a question about accountability and transparency, and I think, hard-pressed council taxpayers, if I might use that phrase here, have a right to understand what the costs are and what the benefits are of this. And I know we get a nice warm feeling from participating, and I know it's about contacts, and I know it's difficult to say in the short term what precisely did we get out of it. But is there actually at any stage a sort of cost-benefit analysis that's conducted to look at, because, hotels in Cannes are not cheap, and there's 274 people gone from Greater Manchester at least, to see exactly what we're getting out of it. I would be delighted if you could come back and say, might not be for Stockport, but here, Wigan, Rochdale, they've all got contracts out of this over the last 5 years or whatever. I'd be delighted to know that. But I don't know that that's the case, and I don't ever see any specifics other than it's important we're there, and by the way, we're now sending nearly 300 people across the conurbation. So I think it's a reasonable question to ask, and if you don't have the figures at your fingertips. I perfectly understand that, but through you, Chair, I'd like to be better informed about exactly how many of these are local authority employees and exactly what qualitative analysis is done in terms of the benefits from our attendance there. Thank you, Chair.
I mean, I take, I understand completely where the points are coming from. Well over 90% of those delegates are private sector. It is absolutely driven by the private sector. The public sector delegates that are there to promote the opportunities within each of those districts, and it tends to be 1 or 2 people per local authority that's sort of, if you like, got a full presence there, are in, I think, every single case sponsored by the private sector. So actually, certainly, can talk about Bolton, for example. They are sponsored by Howard Estates, who pays all the costs for those council officers to be out there, and that is generally consistent across the conurbation as a model. I know it's true for Rochdale and many of the other areas. So generally, there is no taxpayer money actually being spent in that context to take those people out, but neither is there excessive number of people out there to do the job that they're there to do. It's sometimes, there is a full report done on MIPIM every year after the event, which gives the numbers, so we can certainly look at circulating that. That's absolutely fine. And there has been deeper reviews of MIPIM as well, every sort of 3 years, to determine whether public investment should still go into it, whether it's something we should still be obviously facilitating the private investment. I mean, as I say, the private sector put about £750,000 into this, so it's all driven by private sector money, and it's driven by the demand from the private sector to be there. So it's not necessarily driven by the public sector in terms of wanting to showcase there. It's very much as equally, if not more, the private sector themselves. It's sometimes difficult to trace exact conversations at MIPIM to exact contracts. There are and there will be examples of that hopefully we can give. But what I can say is that Greater Manchester is the most invested in part of the UK outside London, and over the last 10 years we've had over £8.6 billion worth of capital investment into this place. And like any, I referred to it as a product before. If you're a consumer product, obviously visibility being front of mind is absolutely critical to continue to have consumers buy your product. And that is why MIPIM is seen as one of those critical times during the calendar year, particularly in capital investment, where that visibility is critical, and it's a great opportunity for us to retain that visibility and that front of mind aspect in front of some of the world's largest investors that are there. As someone that's been for the last sort of probably 7 years now, the meeting schedules that we have with the very, very large global investors that are there are very, very worthwhile. They do result directly in conversations that follow up and actually turn into full investment. So I can certainly say from my perspective that I know it's a place where there's a lot of hard work done, notwithstanding the unfortunate sense that it is a sort of seaside resort can, which often raises eyebrows from the press as well as others as well. But it is quite a grueling 3 or 4 days actually of constant meetings with, as I say, very senior capital investors from across Europe. So, but we can circulate that report certainly in terms of both the deeper review potentially and or the, as I say, the annual sort of summary that's done after the event. I'll check the status of those.
Yeah, I think it is important from a transparency point of view that we do have that information. But I do take your point, and certainly in Rochdale, which I represent, there's certainly Ray can obviously confirm that the last visit we had with our people property conferences, it was funded by local developers. Mark, are you happy with that response?
Just to say that not all of them were sponsored by businesses, because I know that for a fact in relation to my own authority. But I would be interested for you to come back with more detail in due course. Thank you.
Like I say, it's the majority of them, and it's a model that's been repeated across local authorities.
There's a gruelling schedule and a lot of hard work goes on there as well, but I still think it's fair to ask, about the number of local authority employees and what the costs are in terms of the benefits.
And we will follow up on that through the officers. Ray.
Thank you, Chair.
You've mentioned the success of Manchester Airport a couple of times, but I think it's fair to say, in the light of recent media coverage, Manchester Airport has been criticised, on the drop-off payment now. There's been protests by taxi drivers, and only today I've read a report that Manchester Airport is the worst airport in Britain, if not Europe, for disabled access. I just wondered what views you've got on that. Even though I welcome the income coming into councils in Manchester Airport, I'm also conscious that I'm getting complaints in the poor service.
I'll just touch on that. Manchester Airport's in a stage of transition. There's a significant amount of investment going in the development of a new terminal building, around about £1 billion overall. So, and it's growing fast. And obviously, from the point of view of managing that growth, that's the reason why they're having the investment. So there's a lot of pragmatic decisions, I guess, that are being made in terms of how passengers are managed in the interim. I'm no expert, but obviously security measures have increased and are increasing, which does then impact upon the passenger experience as well. On the plus side, obviously, Manchester Airport, as said before, is extremely successful and a really valuable asset for Greater Manchester. And I guess it is looking at its own commercial decisions about how congestion and other issues are managed locally. Perhaps, we could have the Manchester Airport here to maybe talk about that further. That might be a better, rather than have me have me pontificate about it.
They were here at the last meeting.
But I thought they were, yes.
And I will add to that, it was a very, very good presentation we had from them, actually. The opportunities that they're creating is excellent. Any more questions? Chris?
Just very briefly. I think it's an excellent report, and I think it's also absolutely vital that the benefits from internationalisation and the inward investment is felt across all the boroughs across the authority. So I'd welcome any comments on that. You may not be able to tell me, but there is a paragraph in the report regarding Midas and the automotive and aerospace supply chains looking to sites in Bury, Rochdale and Oldham. Are you able to comment on any progress on that?
Can I just jump in there? As I represent Rochdale, I was going to ask exactly the same question, actually.
Can I just touch on the issue of inclusiveness, and perhaps Tim can come in on the Midas one. I think in terms of the wider benefits of internationalisation, a lot of it is around encouraging the small and medium-sized enterprises across Greater Manchester to invest in exporting. That is going to really drive the growth across the city region. And from that point of view, establishing key relationships and deeper relationships with our key markets is vital, and also taking the opportunities, I suppose, within the monitor markets that we've identified to also expand as well. So one example of that is Wigan Rugby League Club recently did a tour in Australia, and through that we've made connections with their chamber, and we can then now connect up our businesses over here to those opportunities within Australia as well. So we're always looking at how we can cross-connect with those markets. And if there are SMEs within the local authority areas that are seeking those connections, then we can build upon those. But it's really about exports, I think, in terms of selling the wider benefits across Greater Manchester.
I mean, purely on the inward investment side, there's a few different parts to that. It's clear with a lot of the global investment we get in, it's biased towards the core, the conurbation core. So probably about, I think, towards 70% will go into the centre. So not just Manchester city centre, but also Salford, and just that general sort of, probably 3-4 square miles, if you like, of central core. Again, a lot of what drives that is the transport network. And I think in terms of what we've done when we've actually analysed, we analysed about 2,000 jobs that came in over the last 2 years, recent employers that had come in, international employers. We did a postcode survey of their employees, and very interestingly, I mean about 30%, and these were firms that had landed absolutely in the city centre of Manchester actually, so about 30% of those employees were Manchester residents, which actually reflected the overall employment figures of Greater Manchester. About 30% of employment is in Manchester as a local authority. But then interestingly, I think 12% were in Rochdale or from Rochdale, about 10% from Tameside, about 9% from Oldham. So actually it was very well spread in some of the other boroughs. And again, is a testament, I suppose, to the transport investment that's gone in order that there is that flexibility in the labour force to gain access to employment wherever it may be. And transport investment has tended to push people into the conurbation core, because that's obviously where the centre of it accumulates. But so there's an element that it is, you know, even though investment is coming into the centre, it's still providing jobs for the whole, if you like. But I also recognise fully that there are both ambitions from local authorities to gain direct investment into individual areas, and there is potentially financial benefits for that as well, and business rates, etc., that are gained through some of those things. So we've also looked at how we can do more in the wider areas of Greater Manchester to have similar impact. We've done that through 2 or 3 different methods, really. One of which is to increase our account management of existing foreign-owned firms that have a base in Greater Manchester. So we've increased that from about 150 firms to 300 firms, which has meant we can account manage a minimum of about 20 firms in each local authority. So even though that still means that Manchester has more account managed, because that is where they are, you know, clustered effectively, or more densely clustered, it means that each local authority is having, if you like, a more intensely account managed service really for foreign-owned companies. So what that means is that, you know, if you take, I don't know, take a Kellogg's in Trafford, for example. So Kellogg's have been in Trafford for over 75 years. There's an element you think, well, surely they're there for good, you know, what more could be done? But there's a huge amount with global firms like that can be done. So they are actually competing with 3 other sites in Europe alone, internally, to buy their product. So we just think, you know, naturally you would think, well, they manufacture for Kellogg's, therefore it just supplies Kellogg's, and it's a main point. Actually, they're competing against the other plants in Wrexham, in Spain, formerly in Germany, to actually supply that, and it's done on cost basis. So they're constantly competing against their own internal facilities in other countries and other parts of the UK. So we worked with them, for example, to put a business case in as part of a global review that Kellogg's were doing, to invest in the Trafford plant into new equipment which would sustain that. And in that round of investment, actually Trafford did receive that, but unfortunately Kellogg's closed one of the German plants as part of that. And so it just shows there is that constant opportunity but also threat for all of our firms that are across the conurbation. So we have that intensity now with a lot more firms in the wider areas to try and grow that investment through people that are already here, because particularly in areas like manufacturing, you know, huge greenfield, brand new capital investments are actually quite rare. So people will generally look to where they have existing capital investment to add more to existing investments, as opposed to, as I say, look to greenfield sites. So it's a key part of the strategy. The other part is how we support 2 things really, one of which is the town centres and the development of the town centres. So we're constantly looking at ways, because at the moment it's difficult for us to place office-based investments when there's no office stock in certain town centres. So, you know, I know Oldham Council have had conversations with providers like Bruntwood, for example, about how they can improve the serviced office accommodation in the centre, which then gives us opportunities to bring office-based projects in. So there's an element of chicken and egg with that, but we are actively looking at ways in which we can help local authorities to devise that offer. And then the second one is more on the industrial side, really, and obviously there's the GMSF ongoing at the moment, and we await that to give more clarity on the future employment sites that we can really start to promote. But the high potential opportunity is really a bit of a preemptive strike from us on that, I suppose, which is how do we build more compelling propositions for the outer areas of Greater Manchester. And so what we looked at was a number of factors with that, where demand, government policy, and, if you like, local skills and expertise came together. So in national industrial policy, they looked at, government was looking at the local supply of components into supply chains in aerospace and automotive. I think on average they were showing only 45% of components were sourced locally versus 60% in our peers in France and Germany. So instantly there was a policy then to see how we could actually start to increase that to levels seen in those countries. Notwithstanding that with Brexit, there is potential, a lot of those components are going cross-border multiple times. So what effect would that have? And therefore, again, incentivise us to increase the local supply so that we don't disrupt those supply chains. So there was that sort of pull factor, if you like. The push factor was then, right, how do we actually develop a proposition which, as I say, suits some of those more industrial sites that are coming through. So it's taking the expertise and advanced materials that exist within Greater Manchester, particularly in some of our universities, combining that with issues that exist within the aerospace and automotive industry, which is around lightweighting, so removing weight from components, reducing fuel costs, reducing, so big part of the industry development area. So we've taken the expertise of advanced materials in order to tackle the lightweighting issue in terms of product development, to supply into those supply chains, and then in putting those into an industrial area in Greater Manchester that has access to good engineering skills, which we know exist, to be fair, around a lot of Greater Manchester. In this case, we sort of positioned it around Bury, Rochdale and Oldham, and around some of the larger sites that exist there already. They have good connectivity in those supply chains, etc. But to be honest, could just as easily go into Wigan or some of the others once we get the conversations going. But we just needed something to centre it at first as part of the pilot with the Department for International Trade. They've been very specific in other areas in the Midlands with Telford and in Yorkshire with Doncaster. So we had to be quite specific, which is why we went for that part of Greater Manchester. But and we're looking to do a second one of these at the moment, which we've got an expression of interest with Department for International Trade around the future of packaging. So again, we have a great, we have a traditional paper industry, particularly in the north of the conurbation and into Lancashire. One of the two major manufacturing sectors in Greater Manchester is chemicals, which will have a really big part to play in developing either new types of recyclable plastics or alternatives too. Food and drink is our other big one, which is one of the biggest consumers of packaging. And then textiles, probably our third largest, which again is potentially an alternative packaging method as well. Likewise, we have big recycling expertise in the Viridor contract. Saika have big bases in Trafford, Wigan, etc. And then to wrap that all up, our overall expertise in advanced materials, again, how we can form alternative new forms of packaging to combat plastics. But those sort of individual components aren't necessarily talking together yet. They act in individual isolation in their own industries. So we're trying to use this as an opportunity to bring those people together around the table to collaboratively look at the future of packaging together, which could actually reinvigorate the paper industry locally, or give new market opportunities to the chemicals industry, etc., etc. So that's the expression of interest stage at the moment. But again, once these propositions are formed, and I'm happy to circulate the existing HPO for the aviation industry as well to everyone, but that one has now been circulated to all the Department for International Trade's international offices. So it's now being proactively pushed as one of 3 national pilots globally across their offices. So, Rochdale, Oldham, Bury and the whole of Greater Manchester, to be fair, is getting a huge amount more publicity in a very high value area of engineering than we've had for years. So I think, we are trying to look at those initiatives where we can develop new propositions for wider areas of Greater Manchester, so that we're not just getting a significant number of our investors into central Greater Manchester, but also being able to diversify that slightly geographically.
I'm being pushed by Susan to actually terminate the meeting because we're running over, but that was such a brilliant answer. I just didn't want to interrupt, actually. I mean, it just really sums up what Greater Manchester should be all about, actually. Being positive, being half full.
Yeah.
And there are massive opportunities out there. Okay, we've got a little problem of Brexit to get sorted out, but some of us can believe we can do it. But that was great, actually. And the whole report, actually, I just thought it was so positive. And clearly, you're doing lots of great things. But I'm going to ask one question on it. What, apart from anything arising from Brexit, what would be your greatest concern or greatest barrier, biggest barrier to stop you achieving this vision?
I think the biggest concern, and it's one that is endemic within Greater Manchester, is changing the culture to investment in terms of particularly around manufacturing. There's some work that we need to do to change that. I mean, Mike Blackburn alluded to that around leadership and management. And it takes time, it takes a generation, but we kind of need to build that up. And I think that's the biggest barrier.
That doesn't surprise me. So thank you for that yet again. We're on to the work plan, which we've actually done.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think what we agreed was that we would look at introducing an item on women in work and kind of general inclusion in either inviting the Fawcett Society in either November, February or June, depending on external speakers. The Task and Finish group would report in either October and November on the Employers' Charter and social value. That we've got a couple of follow-up points on culture that I'll circulate to Officer to kind of to focus on in the report, and that in January we take something on welfare reform and poverty with a Department of Work and Pension person also invited to the meeting. That's it.
One small thing. I noticed some small boxes in the 2009 list at the moment. I don't know whether there is any leeway at all. I would be grateful if it could be considered if Tim, I'm sorry I don't know his surname. Tim Nouns from Midas possibly gets a chance to come back actually in 2019 and talk more to that agenda, which is very interesting, on what I'm going to call the outer central area of GM and all that work that's going on there about the development of it sounds like a mixture of inward investment and growth of firms' activity. I'd like to hear that. I'd like to hear more about that, please.
I would support that very much so. And then we've got just two items to note in: the Digital Full Fibre Investment Programme and the welfare reform. So there for noting, we are going to have a presentation on welfare reform.
Yeah, I'm going to arrange a briefing for the committee in partnership with the other committee on welfare reform, and then we're going to consider that as part of the update in January, I think it is. Yeah. And
the last thing is on the next meeting is the 17th of August, again Friday. Kate, who's now left, made the point before. Can you let people or let the officers know if you are available for that meeting? Because being, if you like, the main holiday season, there is just a chance that we might not be quorate. So, but I hope we are, and certainly I should be here. Many thanks. You've asked some great questions again. So, excellent. Thank you, and see you on the 17th.